Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. In the early years of her youth, Cheryl thought life was a grand adventure and approached every new experience with curiosity. Raised with the values her family had always taught her, she was known as a young girl who adhered to rules. However, as she grew older, her surroundings began to change. She made new friends, and the world became a place far beyond the borders of the small town she had lived in. She found herself drawn into the nightlife with her new group of friends. One evening, Cheryl and her friends went to a party. Surrounded by drinks, dancing, loud music, and flashing lights, they lost themselves in the atmosphere. Everything felt fun and ordinary. At some point, her old schoolmate Jason showed her a few pills and asked, "Do you want to try this?" Cheryl hesitated at first, but everything felt so warm and comforting at that moment. One time won't hurt, she thought to herself. When she joined the party, she had no concerns about what others were doing. She just wanted to live in the moment. It was at that moment that Cheryl's life took a turn. When heroin first entered Cheryl's life, it only gave her a slight sense of relaxation and pleasure. For the first time, she felt such a deep sense of relief. The tension in her body disappeared, and the world suddenly seemed brighter and more beautiful. Everything was clearer, more meaningful. At that moment, she thought she had found herself and was temporarily freed from her old anxieties. That night, thinking that everyone at the party was experiencing the same thing, Cheryl was drawn into the allure of this new world. As time passed, Cheryl began using drugs more frequently. Initially, she only used them on weekends just for fun with a few friends, but over time it became a part of her daily life. She started borrowing money from her friends to buy more heroin and stayed awake throughout the night. While using the drug, she began noticing changes in her body. At first, she didn't think it affected her much, but as the days went by, she felt a growing need for it. What she initially saw as just a temporary escape turned into an addiction that started to take over her life. Cheryl felt like she lost herself while using drugs. However, the drug gave her a sense of relief and escape. It allowed her to temporarily break free from the pressures of her family, friends, and the stresses and worries of daily life. Heroin made her feel as though it was wiping away everything and resetting the world. Every time she repeated this experience, she found herself needing another dose. Just one more time, she would tell herself. At first, she only used drugs on weekends, but soon she started meeting with Jason and her other friends more often. Heroin became a part of the parties, the nights, and the relaxation. Every time she used it, Cheryl felt like there was something missing inside her, something that only heroin could fill. At night, escaping from the nightmares, escaping from the heavy burdens of life, it seemed to her that using the drug was more important than anything else. A void began to form within Cheryl. The joyful, bright personality she once had was replaced by loneliness and depression. However, at the time, she thought everything was temporary. It's just for fun, she would convince herself. Little did she know that with each passing day, the addiction was sinking deeper into her body, and her brain was becoming more dependent on the drug. One of the biggest changes in her life was the decline in her performance at work. The mental fog, constant sluggishness, and never-ending fatigue led her to be distanced from her job. What started as a few mistakes and tardiness eventually led to complete loss. Cheryl had initially seen the drug as just a fun escape, a way to run away from the responsibilities of real life. But over time, this connection to the drug took over her completely. She distanced herself from her job, friends, family, and even from herself. In search of filling the emptiness inside her, Cheryl began looking for a way out. She started to realize how heroin had taken control of her. But on the other hand, the comfort of escaping from this world still held its allure. What started as a temporary escape had rapidly turned into an addiction that was consuming her life, and she had no idea how deep into the hole she had fallen. Cheryl had initially seen drug use as an escape. As enjoyable and relaxing as it felt, each passing day it was pulling her deeper into darkness. After a few more uses, she realized how temporary the peace and relief heroin provided was. That fleeting comfort was replaced with an even greater emptiness. And to fill that emptiness, She needed more heroin. At first, Cheryl still tried to live a normal life during the day, but with each passing day, the first thing she thought about when she woke up was the drug. As soon as she opened her eyes, her head would spin, her vision would blur, and her body would feel numb. In those moments, she knew exactly what she needed to do to escape these feelings. Slowly, over time, this spiraling routine pushed her toward darker and more dangerous paths to obtain drugs. Cheryl began spending most of her days searching for drugs. She started spending her nights on the streets, waking up in a world that seemed broken. The drugs gave her a feeling of detachment from the world, even if only temporarily, and she felt a sense of alienation. Every moment she lost herself in this, it dragged her deeper. At night, she spent time with strange people in abandoned buildings or the corners of parks. Cheryl was willing to risk everything just to obtain the drugs in those moments. As the days went by, Cheryl's life began to fall into a dark cycle. The temporary relief that the drugs provided had turned her into a victim. Her family initially tried to approach her with concern. They believed that the light inside Cheryl hadn't completely gone out and that they could still get her back. But Cheryl kept pushing them away, pretending not to understand. Defying her family, who genuinely wanted to help, gave her a sense of power. Every piece of advice or suggestion made her push them even farther away. Each time her family tried to help, Cheryl would reflect her inner turmoil on them, pushing them further away. One day, Cheryl's mother was searching the streets of their neighborhood to find her. She found Cheryl on the street, drunk and under the influence of drugs. Despite their deep sorrow, Cheryl's family was determined to help her. Her mother repeatedly told her, "Come home, everything will get better." But Cheryl, at that moment, felt how much pain she was in and how lost she truly was. She felt so alone and abandoned that even her family's extended hand seemed foreign to her. "Leave me alone. I need to stay away from you too," she said, turning and walking away. That moment marked the beginning of Cheryl losing control of her life. Her friends tried to stay by her side at first, but Cheryl constantly rejected them, avoiding every social gathering. These friends, who once knew her as fun and cheerful, could no longer stand the changes in her behavior. Many of them decided to walk away from her life. One of her closest friends came to Cheryl's house one day, wanting to give her one last chance. However, Cheryl looked at him with deep emptiness in her eyes. "Don't talk to me again," she said. After spending years with her, her friends realized how permanent this change might be. Cheryl was now alone. That day, her friends said their goodbyes. Things weren't going well at work either. Cheryl, who had once been a hard-working, disciplined employee, lost focus on her job as soon as she started using drugs. Her distractions and absenteeism at work didn't go unnoticed by her boss. After the first warning, things continued for a while, but soon enough, she lost her job. Waking up in the mornings became difficult. She was only concerned with how to get more drugs. The responsibilities and burdens of the real world were easily erased by the relief that the drugs provided, and Cheryl continued to deteriorate each day. Spending her nights on the streets and searching for drugs during the day, Cheryl eventually lost all her connections. Her family, friends, job, health, everything slipped away one by one. Her life was now entirely under the control of drugs. The drug controlled her, making her more and more its slave every day. This powerful attachment had stolen Cheryl's identity, leaving her face to face with the emptiness inside her. At that time, she realized that something needed to change, but she didn't know what to do. She had lost control, and after this loss, she couldn't even imagine what she could hold on to. Cheryl had once lost the safe, orderly life she had, waking up in the same house every morning or having dinner with loved ones in the evening. Simple, yet valuable things were now only distant memories for her. Drugs had completely taken control of her life, pulling her deeper into the hole with each passing day. What started as a simple escape had now fully turned into a way of life. And this way of life had dragged her onto the streets. The days Cheryl spent on the streets were truly a fight for survival. Every morning before starting the day, there was only one thing on her mind: drugs. After a while, the streets became Cheryl's home. With no money in her pockets, she had to find people who could provide her with drugs just to survive. This had pushed her into even darker and more dangerous environments. Now, as she walked the streets, it was no longer about just recognizing a place or being one step ahead, but rather fighting to survive. Most of the time, when she woke up on the streets in the morning, the hopelessness inside her grew even stronger. When she woke up, the coldness of the corner where she had squeezed herself to sleep still lingered in her body. Alone, spending the night on an abandoned box or a vacant park bench, she sometimes thought about the life she had lost. She imagined the job she once had, her friends, and her loving family. She remembered how everything was different back then, how her life was on an entirely different path. But that old Cheryl was gone. The girl who had once been there had gotten lost in these streets. The emptiness inside her seemed like it could never be filled. Cheryl felt the pain of losing her old life most days. Her family had once embraced her with so much love. But now she had resisted every family visit and every offer of help, distancing herself completely from them. Her old friends had also gradually disappeared from her life. The successful young woman who had once been admired at her workplace was now a stranger struggling to survive on the streets. The pain she endured left her with nothing that could show her the way. One morning, as Cheryl walked to an old park, she saw a few familiar faces from the cafe where she had worked. In that moment, she realized just how far she had drifted from her old life and how all her connections were lost. Those people simply waved, gave her a few cold glances, and continued on their way. Cheryl took a deep breath, but there was a great emptiness inside her. With each step, she felt the weight of what she had lost. Memories of a time long past, and the people who were now gone were nothing more than a part of the past. But this was Cheryl's greatest contradiction, and also the reason why the drug had so easily taken control of her. The great emptiness inside her somehow softened with the drugs. On those dark nights, walking alone on the streets, the drugs offered her some relief. For a moment, all the pain and loneliness disappeared, and Cheryl felt a sort of peace. For a moment, everything was beautiful. Everything was right. But then, that feeling of relief faded, and once again, the great emptiness took over everything. The days spent on the streets were leaving deep scars on Cheryl's soul. Over time, even realizing that a new day had begun became a tough struggle for her. The pain from the time lost at night and the agony of the past was reduced by the temporary relief that drugs provided during the day. But at the end of every day, the only thing left was the lost life. Loneliness, coldness, hunger, and hopelessness had become Cheryl's closest companions. And drugs, among these companions, were the one closest to her. The only thing left from the life she had lost was the hours she spent searching for drugs on the streets, and every new drug she found offered her a temporary solution, but it took her one step further from the emptiness inside. After losing everything, Cheryl would take another drink, losing her past even further in the drug. Each day spent on the streets took a little more from her, but at the same time, it kept her alive. Cheryl's life was approaching a turning point during those dark days. One morning, as she walked through the streets as usual, the emptiness inside her had once again intoxicated her. Every day followed the same ritual, the search for drugs, temporary relief, followed by loneliness and regret. Once again she had lost the meaning of life, feeling as if nothing would ever change. But that morning something different happened. That day, Cheryl's fate began to change. As she walked down the street, a man approached Cheryl. His face was unfamiliar. He was older, but there was a kind of patience and understanding in his eyes. At first, Cheryl didn't pay attention to him approaching her, as attention from a stranger in the streets was often dangerous for someone living on the streets. But this man was different. He introduced himself and said he could help Cheryl. At first, Cheryl dismissed what he said. The hopelessness and resentment inside her had made her reject any help from others, but the man's words somehow resonated in Cheryl's mind. "There is a rehabilitation center, they can help you there," he said in a gentle but firm voice. "What are you doing here? You don't deserve this. Your life could have a second chance." Cheryl lowered her head and took a deep breath. At that moment, everything came together. the pain of years of addiction, loneliness, and hopelessness. She had always thought that escape was impossible, but the man's words, at that moment, shone like a flicker of light. In the midst of such a dark tunnel, even this little light was a beacon of hope. She didn't accept the man's offer right away, but after a moment of thought, she decided to give it a chance. She had some knowledge of various rehabilitation programs and treatments, many of which seemed like a waste of time. But everything had an end, and at that moment Cheryl decided to try one last time. Instead of searching for drugs to numb the deep pain inside her, she chose to seize this opportunity. Maybe this is the most right thing I can do in my life, she thought. After a while, Cheryl was admitted to the rehabilitation center. The first few days felt like a complete nightmare. Cheryl felt every moment of the struggle with her addiction, the resistance her body and mind put up. Her deep dependence on drugs seemed to constantly pull her back into old habits. But for the first time, Cheryl realized that she truly had another choice. Slowly, she started to meet the people at the center, each of them with their own story, trying to free themselves from their addictions. The rehabilitation center was designed not only to help Cheryl heal physically, but also emotionally. At first, it was hard for her. Many times, attending therapy sessions seemed meaningless. However, over time, with the support of the professionals and the other patients, Cheryl began to realize that she was truly undergoing a transformation. Each session gave her a chance to understand herself better and face the fears within her. Every day she felt she was progressing more than the day before. One day, during a therapy session, she showed her first emotional response. In a conversation with her therapist, Cheryl realized why she had felt trapped in such a dead end for years. Her addiction was not just a physical need for the drug, but also an inner emptiness. She had been using drugs to suppress her losses, disappointments, and frustrations. Facing the truth was painful, but it was also the first step toward freedom. After a week, Cheryl began to feel stronger. She realized that her addiction was not just about substance dependence. She had lost herself, resorting to those substances just to survive. But here, in the rehabilitation center, she was starting to believe that nothing was impossible for her. Each day's struggles added more strength and resilience to her. She had begun to rebuild herself. Mentally, for the first time, she started to truly feel she was healing. She noticed that the old Cheryl had completely disappeared. The rehabilitation center had offered her the chance to free herself not only from substances, but from all the pain of her past. Here, Cheryl wasn't just detoxing from drugs. She was also undergoing an emotional and psychological cleansing. This perhaps was the most liberating experience she had ever felt in her life. The days spent at the rehabilitation center marked the turning point where something started to change inside Cheryl. Even though the old dark thoughts still visited her at night, she could no longer surrender to them. Instead, she was learning to bring more hope, love, and self-respect into her life. The center had not only treated her addiction, but it also opened a door for her to return to life. Cheryl had realized that redemption was possible, but for it to happen, she had to make the decision herself. Despite the deep pain and darkness within her, her hopes for life had begun to sprout once more. The rehabilitation center was one of the most challenging experiences of Cheryl's life. Breaking free from the grip of addiction required much more than she had anticipated. At first, just stepping into that place took great courage, and with each new day, she had to fight both, physically and mentally. But on one side was the desire to escape her painful old habits and inner emptiness, and on the other side were the challenges this process would bring. For the first time, Cheryl began to feel that there was a real opportunity for change. But this journey would by no means be easy. The first few days were a true nightmare for Cheryl. Every moment was filled with the pressure of her craving for drugs. Each step reminded her of the pain her old addiction had caused her. Her body constantly reminded her of the drug she craved, and it didn't want to stray even for a second. On the first night, not only did she experience physical withdrawal symptoms, but mental disturbances also emerged. She trembled throughout the night. Insomnia intoxicated her. and the feeling of loneliness sank deep into her. When Cheryl wasn't using drugs, she felt like the world was an empty place. Everything seemed meaningless, everything seemed lost, which dragged her into deep despair. But in that moment, the therapist at the center never gave up on her. All she needed was support. She realized that in order to achieve the normal life that many people dream of, she had to leave her dark past behind first. Her eyes reflected the loneliness and losses of the years before. But here, as she began to heal alongside others, each of their stories and struggles gave her hope. Every person had gone through a different journey, but they were all moving toward the same goal: salvation. During her treatment, Cheryl discovered that this journey involved not only a physical battle, but also an emotional and mental one. Addiction wasn't just a dependence on a substance. Her biggest struggle was the war she fought in her mind against her past mistakes, losses, and shame. The group therapy sessions at the rehabilitation center gave her the opportunity to confront the wounds of her past. Like many participants, Cheryl struggled to remember the painful memories. There was so much she needed to say, but she couldn't find the words. The trauma she had experienced in the past had relentlessly surrounded her. At first, Cheryl wanted to reject these conversations. She would ask herself, "Do I really have to talk about this?" Talking about her past left her feeling exposed and vulnerable once again. But over time, she realized that expressing herself fully and sharing this pain was a crucial part of the healing process. For the first time, she felt that others weren't judging her and that she wasn't alone. They too were people who had faced losses and struggled with difficulties in their own lives. This mental and emotional confrontation also helped her make peace with her past mistakes. Cheryl recognized the emotional void that came from childhood deficiencies and the difficult times she had with her family. Her addiction had been a way to fill that void, but in reality, the greatest betrayal she had done to herself was this. Slowly, a process had begun where she started forgiving herself and becoming more tolerant of her past and mistakes. In this challenging journey, Cheryl's physical recovery was also a complex and lengthy process. As her body gradually reduced the effects of drug cravings, it sometimes surprised her with symptoms like dizziness, fatigue, and sleep problems. However, despite this, she began to feel better with each passing day. The withdrawal she experienced, although tough at first, eventually led to her body starting to regenerate. Exercise and healthy eating were important parts of her treatment. The rehabilitation center focused not only on breaking her dependency on substances, but also on holistically strengthening both her body and mind. Mentally, Cheryl was being restructured, and with each passing day, she was being reborn. With the help of her therapists, the most challenging moments became less intimidating as she faced each new obstacle. At first, everything was unfamiliar: therapy sessions, group discussions, and the emotional fluctuations of the other participants all seemed overly complicated to her. But over time, these experiences began to make sense to her. One morning, for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to take a step. The decision to overcome addiction was a huge step she took to face and make peace with the darkness inside her. She felt stronger with each passing day. Slowly, Cheryl began to rediscover herself, make peace with herself, and understand the value of life once again. The treatment process gave her the opportunity to free herself not only from drugs, but from many things in her life. Her mental and emotional healing journey gradually started to bring her inner peace and balance. Though this process was a long and painful journey for Cheryl, it eventually brought her true liberation. Leaving behind her addiction wasn't easy, but Cheryl's determination pushed her forward throughout the process. Each new day was a victory for her, a chance to be reborn, to shed the old Cheryl, and to take control of her life again after. Successfully completing the rehabilitation process, Cheryl decided to completely rebuild the rest of her life. This wasn't just about regaining her physical health. It was a journey to rebuild everything she had lost in the past, from the ground up, based on a stronger foundation. One of the most important lessons Cheryl learned at the rehabilitation center was that change didn't happen at one specific point. It was an ongoing process, Starting to rebuild her life, constantly working on self-improvement, healing, and deciding to one day return, was both exciting and frightening for Cheryl. But eventually, step by step, she moved forward with determination. First, she began to repair her relationships with her family. A bond that had been broken for a long time had always been the most challenging obstacle for Cheryl. Her family had experienced great disappointment due to Cheryl's drug addiction and had lost trust in her. Although it was difficult to expect her to return to her old self, Cheryl decided to reach out to each family member individually. At first, she realized how deep everyone's emotional wounds were. Her family members were giving her time to regain their trust, but Cheryl knew that things wouldn't improve all at once. In order to prove that she had really changed, she accepted that she would need to put in effort every day. At the beginning, talking to her parents and siblings was quite difficult. Although her family members loved her deeply, seeing that they were still filled with great fear and distrust deeply affected Cheryl. However, during those days, Cheryl's greatest strength was patience. She accepted that it would take time and effort to make up for her past mistakes and build trust with every step. As she began to repair the broken relationships with small steps, her family started giving her a second chance. Over time, they began to have meals together, talk, and witness Cheryl's progress. She also decided to return to her professional life. She had lost her job due to her drug addiction, and finding a new job would be a big step toward both financial and emotional stability. Returning to the workforce was a tough process at first. Often the obstacles she encountered while job hunting and the negative responses she received from every position she applied for discouraged her. However, Cheryl's determination was unbroken. After leaving the rehabilitation center, Cheryl chose to start with various part-time jobs. This gave her financial independence and also helped her adapt to the professional world again. Slowly, Cheryl doubled her efforts to regain the job she had lost. She encountered difficulties at first, but her determination during the treatment process started making her successful in her career as well. Within a few months, she managed to gather everything necessary to return to her former job. Her successes also helped her regain her family's trust. Cheryl realized that every small victory she earned was a big step, and she promised herself she would never lose control of her life again. Leaving her addiction behind was Cheryl's greatest achievement. Now she no longer spent her days searching for drugs as she once did, and she was taking determined steps to break her old habits. But the most important change wasn't just overcoming her addiction. It was that she had managed to fill the old void with other meaningful things. Cheryl began to genuinely work on filling the voids she had once had. In order to close the emotional gap she had experienced, she wanted to help others, guide them, and show them the way. She knew this would have a healing effect, both for others and for herself. One of the most important things Cheryl learned during the rehabilitation process was the power of helping others and forming empathy. Cheryl finally realized that leaving her addiction behind and finding herself wasn't just important for her, but also for inspiring others. Helping people who were struggling with addiction like she had gave her true satisfaction and inner peace. Cheryl decided to share her struggles and volunteered to join several local organizations to tell her story. These shares gave others hope, encouraged them, and showed them that change was possible. With each passing day, Cheryl said goodbye to her old life and started a new beginning. As she freed herself from the shadow of the past, she began to add meaning to her life. Now she spent each day in a healthier and more positive way, creating new opportunities to make up for her past mistakes. Overcoming addiction wasn't just about getting rid of the substances in her body. It was also about gaining freedom mentally and emotionally. Cheryl was not only helping others, but she was also rebuilding her own life. Cheryl's journey wasn't easy, but the determination and inner strength she showed at every step held her on to life. Her story became a source of hope, not only for herself but also for others. Once lost in the darkness, Cheryl had now become the very light